Well, they can be beneficial for weight management if they're used intelligently. There is no inherent property of high-intensity sweeteners that either promotes or weight gain or appetite or depresses it. It's how they're used by the consumer that will determine their ultimate effect. So if they are used to substitute for an energy-yielding sweetener or nutrient in the food, there'll be a net reduction in energy intake, and as a result, body weight should be reduced. If, on the other hand, consumers choose to add them to the diet and not displace any other energy source, there likely will be no benefit in terms of weight management. So it's how they're used rather than the nature of the product itself. Yeah, there are a number of mechanisms that have been proposed for this phenomenon, that using high-intensity sweeteners to stimulate appetite, but none of them really have a solid scientific basis to them. Perhaps the one that is discussed most often now relates to the glycemic index of foods. So foods that have what's called a high glycemic index are digested rapidly, and the glucose, the sugar in the food, is absorbed very quickly. When blood sugar rises, insulin is secreted, and that insulin drives the blood sugar level down. It moves the glucose from the circulation into the tissues. And the thinking is that when insulin levels are elevated and glucose levels are depressed, that's a signal for hunger. And so the question is, does the use of a high-intensity sweetener, which might stimulate insulin release, lead to this scenario and drive appetite? The evidence, however, suggests that there is not a causal relationship between insulin levels and appetite, that if you vary the insulin levels in the blood independently of glucose, there's no change in appetite. Similarly, if you manipulate glucose levels independently of insulin, there's no change of appetite. So there's an association there, but not a causal relationship between glucose or insulin and appetite. So the idea that a high-intensity sweetener will alter either glucose or insulin levels doesn't translate to a change in appetite or food intake. And in fact, the effect of a high-intensity sweetener on insulin release might be predicted to have just the opposite effect, because insulin levels in the brain act as appetite suppressants. When levels are elevated, food intake, at least in rodents, decreases. So they may be more beneficial than harmful in terms of moderating appetite. One of the biggest threats, I think, that high-intensity sweeteners pose is that consumers misuse them because of their expectations of their efficacy. You know, we have an interesting natural experiment to draw on here. In the 1990s, high-fat diets were viewed as the most problematic for weight gain, and the food industry responded to this by introducing thousands of reduced fat products. And what we learned was that consumers chose to increase consumption of those foods because they thought, because they were low fat, they could eat more of them. But they weren't necessarily lower in energy or as low in energy as they thought, and as a result, they were taking in more total energy, and body weight continued to rise despite the use of those products. And I think there is the danger that high-intensity sweeteners will be used in the same way, that consumers will feel that if they put a high-intensity sweetener in a beverage, that they have license then to consume a high-energy snack with it, for example. If they are used in that fashion, it's unlikely that they'll be beneficial because, again, it's total energy that is the real driver of body weight. And so if people don't use them in a way that displaces energy from the diet, there likely will be no benefit. And if they overconsume, thinking that they have saved energy by the use of the sweetener, it could in fact have the undesirable, unanticipated result of stimulating intake. But I view this more as an education issue, a user issue, than a product defect or property of a high-intensity sweetener that is biologically potentially dangerous. It's a difficult question. In some respect, one would hope the government would have an interest in protecting the public health and take on that role, but it's a very expensive proposition to educate the population, and the resources, frankly, are not there in the government. The food industry perhaps has more money available for promoting a product or educating consumers, but understandably so, they're going to promote their particular product line. They are, that is the nature of their business, and so they may not be best positioned to provide this kind of information. So it's not clear where messaging will come from, but hopefully partnerships between the government and industry will be formed, and it will be recognized that it's in everybody's best interest to use these products intelligently.